Halt podcast. Let's go.
You're dealing with an expert in guerrilla warfare. With a man who's the best. With guns, with knives, with his bare hands. A man who's been trained to ignore pain, ignore weather, to live off the land. His job was to dispose of enemy personnel. To kill. Period. Win by attrition.
My office.
Yeah, I was looking back there. I'm like, my goodness, that is an office.
It's it's kind of eclectic. My wife says I've got too much junk, but it's my junk. It's all my junk.
My wife said the same thing. One of her gifts to me for Christmas is she came in and she just redid my office upstairs and helped me redo the studio downstairs. So she removed everything. I used to have my bookshelf back there and a whole bunch of stuff. And she's like, no, simplicity. We're getting rid of everything. Got me a couple things mounted so that in the new year now, we're actually, when I'm recording upstairs, I've got an awesome new design background that's going to be coming in here on the 6th. So new design for the upstairs studio. So very grateful for her help.
Yeah. I suppose I could use some design help. As you can see behind me, it's kind of junk stacked up. So,
to the untrained eye, it may seem like junk, but that's one thing I realized once you're done, once you retire, you start to appreciate all the things you gathered throughout your career. Now the coins actually matter. Now the awards and just the little certificates you get from your partner force, all those things change, and they're no longer just, things you put off in a corner. Now you start thinking to yourself like, wow, holy cow, I lived quite a ridiculously exciting life for so long. And everything just kind of blended into each other. It's like one trip blends into the next. And before you know it, you're just stuffing things into a closet or in your home ready room. And as I was going through the process with my wife, I started bringing out a whole bunch of stuff. And you can't help but get nostalgic. You can't help but put yourself back in that place. I'm like, oh, I remember I was in Peru when I got this. Or, man, I took this from, I kept this ripcord from free fall school.
Yeah. I think I'd have to move into a warehouse or something if I wanted to put all my junk up on the walls, all the diplomas and stuff. And she goes, yeah, you've got an I Love Me wall. But anyway, a lot of this behind me has to do with my interests. Lawrence of Arabia, the East German Security Service, stuff like that. So, and then some of it is me. All the coins I've collected over the years. So, starting out with my number 1 coin from 10th group, somewhere back here. Anyway, 1974. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. Wasn't even, that's 10 years prior to me being born.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to believe. So, but then I keep getting these jolts. I gave a talk about Special Forces Berlin out at Fort Carson. This was like 2018, I think, 2019. Must have been 2018. It was one of their unit celebration days, and they had invited a bunch of the old plank holders out there. Some of the guys that were with the unit in 52, 53. Through the 60s and on up. So I was in 10th group in the 70s. They had me out to talk about my book. And after the presentation, I had 2 sergeants come up to me, young kids, probably, 22, 23. They both said thanks and everything. And we didn't know that Germany was divided after World War II.
Yep.
And I'm going, oh, God. Anyway.
Which is a great introduction to today's episode. Ladies and gentlemen.
Today's educational system. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah.
But,
well, James, that's actually the main reason why I want to talk to you today. To everybody out there listening, With me today is James Stejskal. Not only is he a prolific writer, former Green Beret, but he's a man that intimately knows what occurred during the Cold War. Like a lot of people don't remember that Germany wasn't this united nation. It was divided. And our Green Berets that were in that area were part of something that is forgotten now. A lot of people don't remember. They don't talk about or engage in the history of what occurred during that time period, the Cold War. And James, thank you for being here to talk about that, because as we spoke when I reached out to you, our history will be lost if we don't carry the banner forward into the next generation. If we don't continue sharing the stories of what our Green Berets did in that time period, it's going to be forgotten. And war is cyclical. War goes back. It always goes back. And the lessons learned, the things that you've done, that you lived, and you share with us through your books, through your writing, it will become relevant once again. If not right now, it'll be soon. So, James, thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to drop in and talk like this. You say that the things that I've done, my writings will be important to the future soldiers. And it's kind of funny to me because I remember being in 10th Group up at Fort Evans before it moved to Fort Carson. Being with Detachment A in Berlin, spending time down at Bad Tolz with 10th Group. We used to rely on the novels and the histories of the guys that went before us, the guys from World War II, the guys that were in the Office of Strategic Services, the guys that were with the 1st Special Service Force, and even a few things from the CIA. And when we were looking for a solution to a problem, that's what we did. We looked at the history and went back and looked at these things and said, this is an idea. This is something we can use, we can adapt to our present day situation. And what we were looking at was really, we were returning to the old ways of the Office of Strategic Services during World War II. Our mission in Berlin was very much unconventional warfare, stay behind, working with guerrilla forces. And the last time that we had done that successfully was in World War II. So you talk about whether or not it's going to come back into vogue. I think it already has. We see it now in Ukraine, in the Baltic states, in the Balkans. Everybody thinks that the Cold War went away. I think they hit the pause button for about 3 or 4 years, and everything started up again. So we're back in a Cold War. It's a different kind of war. The enemy, quote unquote, remains the same. The Russians have always been the Russians. They have never known a government like ours. They think completely differently than we do. And they are still out there. They posed a threat to our way of life and Europe. Some people will ask, why do we care? Well, I don't know. I just can't see us going back to a state where Moscow would be able to control everything that's going on in Europe. And that's a lot of what Vladimir Putin wants to do. He wants to reestablish a Russian empire. And as long as he is there and wants to do that, not just him, there are a lot of people behind him. They pose a threat to our way of life, and we have to know how to combat it. And one of the methods that we have is unconventional warfare. And so I think we need, after 20-some years in the Middle East, doing a lot of dynamic hyper-imagery stuff, we need to go back and look at and revamp our ways of doing unconventional warfare. And so it's kind of ironic. I started this out as a way to put down the history before it got forgotten. Exactly what you said. 2012, we got together for a unit reunion, Special Forces Berlin. The unit had closed down in 1990 after the wall came down, and we had what was called the peace dividend, and the Army started paring back units that it didn't think it needed anymore. So one of the units that was closed out was Special Forces Berlin in 1990. So here we come along, 2012, almost 20 years, almost 25 years later, and we are getting together and saying, well, we should put this history down on paper, because if we don't, the Army wouldn't. It was still classified. And I had already written a small history book about World War I in Africa, very esoteric book. But we were talking about writing the book, and somebody is saying, yeah, let's do it, and points at me and says, he wrote a book. Which, yeah, okay. And I go, yeah, I wrote a book. I think I can do this. So that started me on the route to writing the history. And it was a very interesting thing. The Army, of course, said, this is all classified. We can't give you any papers or anything to research it. So I started talking to the guys, and I interviewed about 70 people that were in the unit. Some that were in at the very beginning in 1956, some from the 1960s, of course, us from the 1970s, who a lot of us are still around, and then up into the 80s, because I spent basically 10 years in Berlin. I was able to rely on my memory from working in the operations shop, and I had a lot of the guys that wanted to talk to me, and I had a few that didn't. I called up a few guys, and they said, "I can't talk to you about it. It's classified." And I said, "Well, there's a way to get around this. I write it up, and I send it to the Pentagon, and they clear it, and then it gets published." And I said, "I can't talk to you." Hung up. About 6 months later, I get a call from the same guy, and he goes, "I hear you're writing a book." And I say, "Well, last time you hung up on me, I said, "Okay." So that took about 2 years, but it was really interesting. And as I captured that history, I said, okay, the guys that are going to be interested in this are the guys that served in the unit, their families, and a few of the other guys from 10th Group or whatever. And it kind of has ballooned because no one, I mean, there's a lot of books out about Vietnam, but that mission was somewhat different. It's counterinsurgency. Yeah, we were doing cross-border stuff, long-range recon, special operations, but most of it was not irregular warfare. It was not unconventional warfare. And so of late, this history has sort of pushed the buttons that people want to talk about. And a lot of guys are coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan saying, okay, that mission is done. What do we do now? And for me, it's like, okay, pause button has come off in Europe. These are the kind of things that we need to start looking at. And so the history has come back in some ways to haunt me, because I'm a lot busier now than I was 2 years ago talking to people, but it's a good thing. Go down to Bragg, talk to the people down there. Fort Campbell a couple of weeks ago. Out to Fort Carson several times. I don't think Okinawa will invite me out because it's too expensive, but whatever. Anyway, so yeah, that is my encapsulated history. And, well, everything else is behind me, like I was saying, my history and the history of some other things. So
yeah, it's so true though what you said earlier. We spent the past 20 years focusing on only one aspect of our mission set, just one small factor of what we can do as Green Berets. We're a great multi-tool for individuals and organizations that don't know how to utilize us. And we have We became a victim of our own success. Direct action is great. It is within our bag of tools. But our bread and butter, the things that make us different from every other special operations unit out there, is our unconventional warfare skill sets. It's what gives us that seat at the table. It's what made us such a powerful force on the battlefield. And we flexed this direct action muscle for so long that when it comes to recruitment, we've lost the ability to teach or speak on the unconventional things, the UW, the guerrilla warfare. That's what we really need to understand is we have to sell that. We have to make that the thing that we champion at the end of the day. There's always SEALs. There's always going to be Ranger Regiment. We cannot forget what our priorities are when it comes to warfighting. It has to be unconventional warfare. We have to be able to set ourselves aside by saying, hey, we have guys here that can go behind enemy lines and develop and create and have a unique skill set to build a fighting force. And now more than ever, that's really what we have to focus on. But there's still those hardliners that are like, no, we're direct action only. This is our main thing. It's like, no, times are changing. And you said it perfectly. Ukraine was a great example of that. I think 10th Group was still able to have a lot of success with what they had done over the years. And with the implementation of the 4th Battalions, we had a lot of great success there. But how do we move forward into this new warfare? How do we move forward into this new, we call it new, but it's been here before. How do we move into the next chapter of combat and bring our force back to the fold and understanding that UW is the one thing that you have to build back. It's the one thing that you have to champion within your, because I remember when I left the teams, we had this influx of young guys coming in who are looking for their Afghan experience. It's like, no, like you have to be looking forward. Afghanistan's done. It's over. You have to become a scholar again. You have to become a reader, a passionate learner, studying history. And it's not the sexy thing. How do we overcome that? How do we look to those new Green Berets and try to build that back up? Because man, the Lawrence of Arabia is that model that we have to look at. It's the individual that's educated and passionate about culture. And that's something that I haven't seen in a very long time.
Yeah, it's a hard one because it's not like you can go back and say, okay, this is the model that we have to follow. It's the model that you start with.
Yeah.
And then you have to improvise as you get along. We need a lot of forward thinking, a lot of people that want to sit down and say, this is how things might go. And if you put a whole bunch of these people together, then you start to get an idea of how diverse warfare is and how you have to prepare for it. Going in and we cannot send an A team into China and expect them to work behind the lines very easily.
Yeah,
but we can find people of Chinese extraction, and we can train them and work with them and have them do the work for us. There's been a lot of books written about that, how you work by, with, through your local people.
Yeah.
We have to go back and look at all these things and then find out the best way to adapt them to what we think is going to happen next. I know there's a lot of people out there looking at cyber warfare and the electronic spectrum of how things are going to be fought. War in space, which is kind of scary. But there's always going to be a place for working with the indigenous people, the local people, and we have to know how to do that. And so, yeah, we've got a ways to go, but at least we're starting to look at it again.
Yeah. People are starting to ask the right questions. Well, we know the organization is always going to be the organization, regardless of the changes in time. It's higher headquarters is still going to be a hard beast to try to change course.
Well, the Green Army is always going to be the Green Army, and there's
Yes.
always going to be people out there that want to have their marching bands and their troops that can parade, and and then there's going to be special forces who are always going to be the problem children and the ones that cause all the trouble. So I guess we have to live with that.
We
anyway.
do.
It's going to be interesting.
And I want to ask you to take us back to your days on the ground in Berlin, because I have no idea what that world would have been like. What was that day in and day out like?
I go back and I think about this sometimes, and I compare it to some of my later days in the Army, like in the 90s. So I got out and I retired in 1996. It's before some of the people that are in the Army right now were born. And what I saw from Vietnam, I came in at the tail end of Vietnam. I did not go to Southeast Asia, but I served with a lot of people there. When the 1970s started, the Army was in pretty bad shape. Morale was bad. They had gone to the volunteer Army. And up at Fort Devens, 10th Special Forces Group was trying to retain its manpower for the European mission. We still anticipated a possible war in Europe, but we had no clue when and if it would happen. So it was a strange time to be in the Army. But when I got to Berlin, it all sort of changed for me, because here I was in this city that's surrounded by a wall, a total population of around 5 million people on the east and west side of the border. And we are in civilian clothes walking around this city trying to blend in with the Germans and a lot of other people, Turks and Yugoslavs and people from Western Europe who were trying to avoid the draft or whatever. And it was just it was like being dropped into the middle of a Jean Le Carré novel or something. To be able to walk around the city, to walk on the wall, right near the wall, and know on the other side there are Russians and East Germans who are there potentially to kill you. And you're right in the middle of your own operational area before the war kicks off, which was an advantage for us. But it was just a whole different mindset you had to adapt. You didn't. It wasn't like you could go home and switch off. You had to be in the mindset all the time, 24 hours a day. You are in the operational area preparing for something. And on one hand, I don't think we thought too much about what might happen if the war kicked off. What we were doing was trying to prepare ourselves for if it would come off. Yeah. So it was an amazing experience to be there and to live through that. And we had a commander, and a sergeant major, and leaders who understood that this could not work like a regular Army unit, a regular Special Forces unit even. The control they had over us was pretty ironclad, but it got really fuzzy as you went down. And they basically said, this is your mission. You have to figure out how to do it. I'm not going to tell you how. And they gave us the latitude and the tools to do that, which was really kind of interesting, because when people came over from Bragg or even from Saga down at Stuttgart, they had no clue of what they were looking at. They'd come in and say, "What's your mission?" And we would brief it to him, and they would just sit there, kind of slack-jawed, going, "And you think you can do this?" And we were going, "Yeah, we've been preparing for this since 1956, working about how to get over the wall, through the wall, how to get to our targets, how to disguise ourselves, to work undercover." And we would talk to them about the OSS, and they had already forgotten that. They were talking about dropping guys, into the forest after the war started. And we're going, okay, that's one method. We did that in World War II, but how about putting people out there beforehand? And that's what we were doing. And when they would come out and try to evaluate us, they had no clue of what they were even looking at. It was weird, but it was an unbelievable experience.
Yeah, I can't imagine having the ability to own your mission without constantly having to call up to hire on a sat phone, on HF, just constantly being tethered. That's where we were at. Like, it seems to me that back then there was they had a better understanding that, look, you have to be willing to give the guys on the ground the ability to, and the authorities that they need to execute their missions without hovering above them. And that's something that we've become hyper connected on the battlefield, which is to a detriment. And I get it. Nothing's worse than not knowing. But at the same time, if you are constantly pushing to that young commander to get on a sat phone, to call up on Iridium, he doesn't have time to think through what he's doing. You're just constantly pulling back on a leash. That would have been a great command structure, just be able to be left alone to do your job.
Yeah. I want you to imagine putting a team into a city, not 12 men, but probably 10 or maybe 8, and have them operate securely with only one means of contacting headquarters. And that means was an HF radio, either one of the old OSS radios, which was about this big, or the big ANGRC 109, which was huge. And our headquarters element is not in Berlin, but in England.
Wow.
So we have a commo guy who is sending messages from a hotel room in Berlin with a long wire antenna rigged inside the room to transmit. And these guys could do it. The echoes were really good. And then you've got your team out on the street, and you're not walking around in groups of 6 or 7. You're walking around in groups of 1, maybe 2. And your method of communication between the team leader and the team sergeant, who are operating separately, is not a radio. It's not a telephone. It's a dead drop.
Yes.
With an encoded message, which takes about 3 days to turn around. Okay, you have a scheduled dead drop to put in your message on Tuesday. So you do it on Tuesday. At the bare minimum, you've got like a 6 to 12-hour gap between dropping it off and somebody picking it up for security purposes. So somebody picks it up, takes it back to their hotel, figures out how to decrypt it, either a one-time bat or a book code or whatever, decrypts the message, and then they have to get it to the radio guy to send out the message to England. So right there, you've got probably a 24-hour gap at least. And then to get the message back and retask that team is going to take you another 2 days. So in the interim, you've got your team spread out, basically operating on autopilot. They know what to do. They are not talking a lot, A, because it's insecure to be talking too much, and B, because it takes so much time. So it's you have to have people that can work completely alone.
Yeah.
And know what to do, know the mission, and know what the task is, how to accomplish it, and how best to do it. And it's a difficult thing, but special forces are the best people to be able to handle it. We used to get our instruction from of course, from Fort Bragg, how to do unconventional warfare stuff. But like I said, these people really didn't know anything about working in an urban environment. So for that, we had to go to the specialists, and that was the CIA. And so they would come and teach us. And these were old guys, retirees. They called them annuitants, and they would come to town and they would teach us tradecraft, how to put in dead drops, how to do surveillance, how to do all that stuff. These were guys that went back to the 1950s who had learned on the streets. Some had served in Vietnam running agents there. But these were guys that knew how to operate essentially like their forefathers did, the guys from the OSS. And one or two of the guys had that kind of experience with World War II. So this, again, it's an unbelievable experience being able to go out in your area of operations and practice stuff with these guys from the agency. And just like I said, it was amazing. But again, you have to have people that are trained and able to work with no umbilical cord.
Yeah.
And it's hard to do these days. Yeah.
Absolutely. And were you guys ever doing actual incursions to the other side?
There were incursions to the other side, but most of the time it was done under the auspices of what was called the military liaison mission, because we could do that legally. The problem with going across, we could go into East Berlin. That was an easy thing. Going into East Germany, if we had somebody caught there, it would have been, I think the word is ugly.
Because some of the rumors
there was what was called. Yeah, go ahead.
Some of the rumors that we heard growing up, going through the pipeline, was it was a known thing that if soft teams were found on the other side, it was just the Mongolian horde was coming after them. Like, it was a known thing that if any SF person or any information was ever leaked that there was a soft member, soft team, it would just be complete annihilation. Like, they were hyper vigilant to the point where they understood, like, be on the lookout. If it's found, it must be taken out as soon as possible.
Our mission set was basically slow down the Russian advance to the border for 24 to 48 hours, 72 at the most. So if you think about it, slow them down for 24 to 48 hours, that's about what your lifespan was going to be if the war started. The unique thing about Berlin was around it was something called the Berliner Ring, which was the railway system.
Mm-hmm.
And all the trains from Czechoslovakia, well, not all of them, but quite a few of them from through Poland and from Russia would come straight to Berlin and around the city and then move west. So we knew that if we could slow down the trains, we could slow down a lot of those Russian movement forward. So that was our target set, a railway and waterways around the city. Beyond that, if you survive that first 24 to 72 hours, then we would go into the unconventional warfare mode and put together a resistance package. Quite frankly, not many of us figured that we would live that long. the Russians, you were absolutely right. They would do it. They would commit a division to find one special forces team, and that means saturating the area.
And that's insane. That's the and it kind of makes you feel good that you warrant such a response, but at the same time, there's
that great cartoon of the mouse who is the one great last stand. Anyway, but that was the interesting part about him. So I think on one hand it would have been, I think somebody else put it would have been glorious. Probably no one would survive, but it would have been glorious. So anyway, one of the interesting factors that came out of Berlin, though, was when Eagle Claw came around. Very early in the 1970s, about 1974, Berlin was tasked to come up with what was then called counter-hijacking operations mission. And that's when the airplane hijackings were spiraling out of control. The Germans and the Israelis and the British were very interested in it. People back in the States, not so much. So we had the FBI to handle that stuff. But U.S. UCOM said, we don't have any capability for counterterrorism, what we now call counterterrorism. So the Berlin got tasked to do that. And we looked at this mission as very much, again, going back in history, basically what we were doing is trying to figure out exactly how the terrorists were doing their missions and how you would counter that. So how do you best become a cop who is fighting burglars? You have to know how the burglar operates. So we became kind of the military's own terrorist organization, which we were already doing in Berlin anyway. It's the best way to know how a terrorist operates is to become one. So we were doing operations in Germany and in England against the services of those countries, where we would infiltrate 4-man and 6-man teams into a country and have them operate as a terrorist. This is an exercise. And they would send out their best people to try to find us. In England, it was against MI5 and MI6. So when Eagle Claw came around, Charlie Beckwith said, I can handle the embassy, but I cannot handle the foreign ministry, or two separate targets. So our commander said, well, we've been training for counterterrorism for this long. We've been certified since 1978 by the Pentagon, earlier than that by SOTV. And so we knew that part of the business. Charlie Beckwith had come to the city just to see what we were doing. I think he came over 1978 to compare training. So we set up a team to go in, and one team did go into Desert One to take out the foreign ministry. But what people also don't realize is the only successful aspect of that mission were the guys that we sent into Tehran to do the advance force, to do the reconnaissance of the objective. Yeah. And those guys were able to do that because of the training they got in Berlin. How to work undercover, civilian clothes, to collect intelligence that could be used for special operations. That was one of the prime capabilities, one of the prime missions of Detachment A, how to do that.
Yeah. And
very much unconventional warfare.
100%. It gets lost in history, obviously, because of the incredible loss of life and the incident that happened. Mission couldn't be kicked off. So we
Right.
forget about that. We don't talk about that. That was a success. Yeah, it's one of the things that we have to look back on. It was a sad and very, very painful event and lost a lot of lives, but it gave birth to a lot of great innovations. Joint commands, being able to be interoperable. And of course, as you mentioned, that training that went down, that's invaluable, and it continues today. That is something that we as Green Berets go through in various different courses to learn all that skill trait. That knowledge is still there.
Yeah, that's very true. The capabilities that came out there, for better or worse, U.S. SOCOM, but the capabilities that Berlin had for that kind of undercover operation have transferred on now to other units. The aviation assets, obviously, things there, interoperability with communications, those are all extremely important. So it was a hard lesson to learn, but there's been a lot of good that came out of it.
Yeah. And have to imagine that when a new guy showed up to Berlin, that must have been like any other soft school, learning from a fire hose, just taking in so much information. What was it like when you guys received new Green Berets?
I think the best comparison I could make was to say that it was like going through a fraternity initiation.
I knew it.
That involved oh God, what was the John Belushi movie?
The Animal House.
Yeah, I think they modeled that after us. And I am being 65% serious about that. Yeah, it involved training, learning how to use different weapons, learning the street craft. Back then, the O&I course taught a modicum of intelligence tradecraft, but if you weren't an E6 or E7 that had gone to O&I, you didn't have that. So you had to learn it. And everybody on the team had to know that well. You had to have the language training. You had to know the city backwards and forwards, how to get around on foot and by public transport, whether that was the metro or the bus or whatever. You had to know the enemy. And we had incredible intelligence resources. The military liaison mission was the legal mission that the Russians ran in West Germany and the Allies ran in East Germany, to monitor each other's armies, provided tons of information, the overflights, and plus our own reconnaissance. So we knew our operational area backwards and forwards. So the new guy was given all this information at once, and it was like the floodgates opening. One of the things that we had to do was Warsaw Pact vehicle identification.
Oh.
And yes, extremely tedious. Not only did you have to identify a tank, but you had to identify communications vehicles by the antennas they were using.
Oh, geez.
And what types of units those vehicles were attached to. So if you were up to snuff on this, basically you could look at one or two vehicles, and you could tell what unit was in the area, what kind of unit at least. And that's the kind of stuff that you had to learn. I remember one thing that was a picture of a T-80 tank, and I used this on my presentation. Shows a tank under a tarp, and the only thing you can see is the track and the track guide that goes through the wheels. The track guide is hollow. It just looks like a paper clip, essentially. And if you know that tank, you know that it was a T-80 because that was the only Russian tank that had a hollow track guide. And that's not an amazing fact. That's just the kind of nitpicking, esoteric stuff you had to learn for this job. And it was a pain, but yeah, it was also pretty amazing. The guys that got to go on the missions out in East Germany would often run into a convoy of Russian or East German vehicles. Two guys in a car. One's a Russian-speaking officer, military intelligence officer. The other one's a German-speaking driver, who's usually an NCO. And they would drive the length of these convoys, and they would call off each vehicle as they were passing it onto a tape recorder. The type of vehicle, unit markings, while the officer is taking pictures of everything. To do that, you had to know the stuff backwards and forwards. So it was a pain, but that's the kind of stuff you had to know. Everybody had to be able to send and receive Morse code, minimum of 10 words a minute. Of course, the communicators were 18 to 20 words a minute, and we had some guys who would be able to do 25. But knowing Morse code and being able to take it down rapidly was a key thing. So Morse code was important. The weapons, we had to be able to use not only the U.S. weapons so that you could pass your MOS test every year, but you had to be able to use all the different weapons that we had, which were all foreign. German machine guns, Russian machine guns. Had to know demolitions. We practiced improvised musicians all the time, making stuff from chemicals that you could get through the pharmacy, just in case. For the CT operation, we were working with linear shape charges, things like that for door entries. And this is in the 70s. So a lot of the stuff that you see these days is all being manufactured by people. Back then, we were making it by hand. We made our own flashbangs out of grenade simulators. So instantaneous instead of not quite instantaneous, but very short fused instead of the 7 seconds that a standard grenade simulator has. So yeah. Knowing how to use the U-Bahn was in itself a feat, because you had to know the system to know how to get on the trains, where to get off, which stops to use. And we would often give a new guy, everybody had to go through it, basically a test that consisted of go out and find these different things. So you would get a clue. And it was a particular building and street address. And so you might have 12 different clues, but you've also got a time limit. So you have to figure out how to get to all these different things by whatever mode of transport you could get there fastest. Bus, metro, whatever. Not your own car, of course. So that's just the kind of stuff that we did on a routine basis. So,
yeah.
There were some easier things like going. But there were some easy things like going to see a German movie and being able to explain it afterwards. So at least you could eat popcorn and drink beer during those. So that was fun. Anyway.
Yeah, the beauty of this is all these things we can now look at our phones, for example, and think, well, now all this stuff we don't need to use. We don't need to do the brain power anymore. We don't do the manpower. We just have phones. We have all this tech. You're not going to always have tech. You're not going to always have, and in fact, the tech is a vulnerability.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Time and time again, it's shown us that it's something that can be completely used against you. And all the skill sets, all the tradecraft you just talked about, like that's relevant today. It's not just useful knowledge of how the guys in Berlin were able to operate. You can still do this today. It takes work. It takes a lot of work.
And now you have to find ways around those technical problems. I remember when cell phones first came out and we started using them, you might have 6 different cell phones to communicate with all your different people. And then we started to figure out, well, if these can be traced by us, they can be traced by the other people.
Yep.
Text messaging, the same thing. All those neat little ways we thought were so clever. When the Arab Spring happened several years ago, people were talking about how the secret text messaging was such a great thing for the resistance groups and stuff like that. And I was going through a course right then, and one of my professors said this is going to change the way of revolution across the world. And by that time, I had spent some time with my second career, which was straight intelligence, and I'm going, you better be careful of what you say, because the people that are watching these people are going to figure out how to turn it around. And that's exactly what happened in Syria. They turned it around and they were able to crush the resistance because they broke through all their stuff. The agency was trying to do funny things with the computers, secret messaging. And they used it across the board for a lot of their people in China. The Chinese figured that out and were able to eradicate like a very high percentage of our assets that were working in China, all because we were complacent and not looking at both sides of the equation. So that's one of the big things you have to do.
Yeah, it's if it seems advantageous and amazing, chances are, if it's the easier it is, the worse it's going to be for you. And it goes back to everything. Do you want to sleep in a nice, wonderfully dry and comfortable bed down location? Probably not. You're going to still go down to the dirty, disgusting, thick, swampy area that's really hard to get into. It's not fun, but it's safe.
Go back to Marion. I keep on saying Rogers Rangers, but Marion the Swamp Fox.
The Swamp Fox, yeah.
So you have to go back there. Yeah, and Murphy's Law. Tracers point both ways.
Absolutely.
But we'll see. We're going through some interesting times here. Not on the political side, which is a total abomination, but on the military side. On the military side, with how we're trying to adapt to the threat, and now we've got an interesting time in front of us. I'm seeing the Russians. The Russians are one thing, but more worrisome now, I think, are Iran and China. And what I am predicting is that the Iranians right now have succeeded in blocking or causing problems at 2 of the biggest choke points on our logistics, our aquatic logistics system, the Red Sea and the Gulf of Hormuz.
Yep.
The Black Sea is also pretty much closed down. So that leaves basically, I think, 2 more big choke points that could be shut down. And those are around Indonesia, the Gulf between Thailand and Cambodia and the islands, and around the other side. So Well, I think if our adversaries want to cause us problems, that's one thing they are going to be looking at, shutting down our economic system by causing those choke points to be closed down. So we'll see how we adapt.
Exactly. It's a very tumultuous time right now, and now more than ever. This is why I feel it's very passionate about as Green Berets get out from the past 20 years and they find themselves going back to their communities. We're still leaders. Our creed says, succeed in my mission so I can live to succeed again. Continue serving within your community. The work's not over. It takes great men, great individuals such as ourselves that are willing to give back within our community, take care of each other, mentor others, because we are not going to always be the warfighter. We're not going to always be able to re-enlist and re-engage in the next fight. But what we can do is we can help foster that great American spirit in others. That's what makes America so great, is the American people. But when we lose sight of what it means to be American and what it means to serve and be of service to others, then we lose America itself. So any Green Beret that's out there listening, that's retired, you're not done yet. Take a knee, take a deep breath, but start serving again, start giving back to others. And the most important thing we can do in this time, in this day and age, is be willing to mentor and coach the next generation. There are kids everywhere. There are young men that are looking for direction and drive. And you can give that to them. It's never going to be perfect. The military, as we know, it's never perfect. But I will argue that our regiment is still good. There are still good men. There's still good people in there. And if we can help foster and elevate other individuals to dream and achieve that, then we have a fighting chance. I truly believe that within SOF is the ability to take care of a lot of issues and a lot of problems. We just have to be willing to get invested again. And it is hard. It is difficult to tell somebody like, hey, you just retired, give back. But in reality, that's what we need to. This is a great country.
Absolutely. And that's kind of the role that I see myself in now. Inadvertently, I've come back into it all through my writing. And I think that means basically that, to sort of paraphrase something, that each of us should be able to give back according to our abilities and our means. Because there are people out there that really want to hear this. They want to learn, they want to listen, and they want to grow. And the best way for us to help is to give them the advice that we can, whether it's good or bad advice, or maybe it's bad advice because it's based on bad experiences. But when they hear it, it'll be good advice. But anyway, that's I think we all have a role to play.
Absolutely. Now, after your time and everything wound up, coming to an end in Berlin, where did you go from there? What came after?
So I spent from 1973 when I came in until 1989 in Special Forces. I did one tour at Fort Bragg with the SERA Committee. I did 10th Group and Detachment A, and then the follow-on unit for Detachment A that was in Berlin. So by 1990, I was ready to do something else. And I came back, and this is the part of the career that I cannot really talk about a great deal because I spent the next 6 years with Northern Virginia. And that sort of it's an outfit that was created as a direct result of the Iran mission. So I spent my time there, went some interesting places, got pretty badly beat up in Somalia, and kind of slowed me down. I was not able to do a lot of the stuff that I wanted to continue to do, but I had to adapt. You have to adapt no matter what.
Absolutely.
And I think resilience is part of it. So I was disappointed, but then I realized that I was a CW3 at the time, and in reality, the Army wasn't going to let me play out the field much more anyway, because I did get promoted to CW4, and after that, you're pretty much well, you should be on the staff teaching the young guys. Okay,
Absolutely.
so I saw my career kind of flatlined, but as part of my job in the Army, I ended up wasn't part of my job. It was because of my job. I met my wife, who was a diplomat, an American Foreign Service officer, and so I decided that I was going to get out of the Army and do whatever I could to follow her around. She was doing overseas assignments. Yeah, so I'm looking at different things, being a journalist, being a photographer, stuff like that, and she actually was going back to Africa, close to where I had originally met her. And I was a civilian at the time. I retired in 1996, so I was honing my skills as a photographer and other things. And she goes out to a certain location to get a classified briefing on the country she's going to be serving in, because she was going to be the number 2 officer. And while she was out there, a guy came up to her and handed her a yellow Post-it note and said, "Have your husband call this number." That is a serious story. And I called the number, and they say, basically, "We hear you're looking for a job." And I go, "Yeah, I am." And they said, "Well, how would you like to be our representative in that country? Because we don't have anybody there." I said, "Okay, what's the deal?" So they hired me on as a contractor, and by now I think you know who I'm talking about,
Yeah.
the agency. They hired me on as a contractor, and I worked for them as a contractor for 2 years, and then they said, I think it was because I was making too much money as a contractor. They said, "Wouldn't you really rather be a staff officer? I mean, a regular officer?" And I said, "Yeah, job security, etc. A contract can be canceled at any time."
Yeah.
So after that, I became a standard officer. Long story, but I spent a total of 13 years with the agency, in the field mostly, doing the kind of things that similar to what I was doing in Berlin and elsewhere. And I had just a really enjoyable time. And then I got to be retirement age, and they said, "Well, basically, you've got one more year to live in this service." And I said, "Okay, well, after that, I'm just going to retire." So that was 2013, and I was still traveling with my wife, and I started to write. First, I started to write histories, and then I started to write fiction novels, mostly stories that I could not put into the Berlin books or other books. The fiction I write is based on true stories and tell a lot of the old Cold War stories that probably should be told so that they can be remembered. And I've been doing that since. And the Special Forces Berlin book, as I said, has been recognized by a lot of the people at the schoolhouse, and it's used as a training aid, so to speak. So they started to ask me to come back and talk to the students. So I talked to the warrant officers. I talked to some of the battalions, 4th battalions especially. So it's been interesting. So it's become my new avocation, I think.
Well, I think it suits you, sir. I can't thank you enough for coming on here today and sharing not only your story and what you went through, but being willing to share what the unit did in Berlin all those years ago and helping to keep it alive. Because if we don't do this, if we don't engage, if we don't share, if we don't talk, if we don't write books about it, we're going to forget about it. We're not going to share it. Is that the new book?
No, this is actually the first one. I don't have the new one out here. This is the novel that started me off, and it talks about SF in Berlin. I think my current one is probably even more timely. It's called Dead Hand, and it's about. Oddly enough, I came up with this idea that Russia might actually win the war in Ukraine, and what would happen after that.
Oh, I like that.
So, like I said, that one just came out. So, but I'm having, book sales, but the people that read them like them. So I'm happy. If a writer gets a good review, then that makes him want to write more. So I'm writing a lot about the Cold War.
Heck yeah. Well, we're going to do our part here in Security Halt. After we get done with this, just shoot me an email with all the books, and I'm going to drop it on the episode description for this episode of the podcast, and then throw it out through our social media. Again, James Stejskal, author of Special Forces Berlin, author of upcoming book Dead Hand, and great Green Beret warrant officer. Thank you for being here today, sir. Anytime you want to come back on the show and share history with me, I would absolutely love it. This is an absolute pleasure, sir. Thank you for being here today. If you like what we're doing and you're enjoying the show, don't forget to share us, like us, subscribe, and head on over to our Patreon where you can be part of our community and get access to all of our episodes as soon as they drop. And remember, we get through this together. Take care.